Alright, so today we're going to be looking at unit statuses. They're basically effects that you can put on players or objects or characters, and I'm going to give you a quick demonstration here. So if I walk on this platform here, you'll see that I get a move speed bonus. I can run around really quickly and then it goes away. And then similarly, if I jump to the next platform, I get this jump boost effect where I can jump really high. And then if I jump onto this one, I kind of missed. But the whole point is that you can get a shield. Here we go. And this is also a unit status, believe it or not. And we're going to take a look at some applications of unit statuses, how you can enable them or disable them, and the different types of unit statuses that exist in the Miliastra editor. So first, let's go into our combat preset page. In the unit status section, you can see here I already have some unit statuses made already. But basically, if you just click on new status, let's make one from scratch. We'll do test unit status. You can see that every status comes with a configuration ID. And so this is what we use inside of our node graphs if we want to reference it to activate or disable it. In our basic settings, we have maximum stack layers. So basically, if I apply a unit status onto a character, let's say there's a duration of 10 seconds, right? So let's say 5 seconds after I set a status on a player, I want to add another unit status, the same one, but I want to add a second one. So this number here allows us to go up to a certain amount of stacks. So basically the unit statuses stack on top of each other and they each have their own independent durations. And so this is kind of useful if you want to change the behavior of a unit status depending on how many stacks there are. But it's also good if you want to limit the amount of unit statuses that can be active on a player at once. We actually see this a lot in the base game with certain weapons where you'll get certain buffs and you can get, for example, a 5% bonus in attack and it stacks up to 5 times, but each stack has a duration of 10 seconds, right? And so while you're attacking with the bow, I think the latest Venti bow actually has this where every time you attack you get like a 10% boost in damage. So you would use stacks to control how many times the player can acquire a certain amount of attack boost or defense boost or something like that. For overlapping data update, so this is pretty interesting. If we just hover over this, it says that if you acquire a unit status and you already have the maximum number of stack layers, then the new unit status is going to replace the oldest unit status that the player has. So for example, let's say I have a maximum of 2 stacks and then I apply a unit status and then I'll apply the same one, let's say 3 seconds after, and then I want to do it again 3 seconds after that, then it's going to replace the first unit status with the third unit status because there's only 2 allowed. So it's basically just replacing the oldest one in the stack layers. So what's going to happen if you have just one layer, every single time you get a unit status, it's just going to replace the one that you already have with the new one. So you can kind of extend the duration of a unit status by just constantly applying it to the player, for instance. But it's very silly to constantly add a unit status to the player in order to make it infinite. So obviously we have an option for infinite duration. So if we just turn that on, you can see we don't have an option to change the time anymore. And so whatever unit status effect we get will live with the player until we remove the unit status. However, a good thing to know is that if the character dies, then all the unit statuses that are attached to the character go away. So just so you know, infinite duration will stick unless you remove it yourself or unless the player dies. And then we have stack share duration. So this is kind of cool. It's a little bit niche, but basically if you have a unit status on the player and then you add another unit status, the second time you add the unit status, you can extend the duration of the first status. And so similarly, if you already have 2 statuses on the player and you add a third, then the existing statuses will have their durations extended as well. And so you can configure that here. This is kind of useful if you only have, for example, 1 stack layer and you don't allow overlapping data update so that you don't reset the stack. Instead, what you can do is when you get a new stack, you can extend the duration by 2 seconds, for example. You can also set a maximum extended duration limit. So if you don't want the extended durations to exceed a maximum time, so for example, let's say my initial runtime here is 10 seconds and every time I get a new stack, it'll apply an extra 2 seconds, right? It'll extend the duration by 2 seconds. After 2 stacks, the maximum duration is going to be 14 seconds. Let's say I don't want it to exceed 15 seconds, so that after my third stack, it's not going to go to 16 seconds, it'll just cap off at 15. So you can use it for something like that. You can attach node graphs to a status so that when you apply a unit status to, let's say, a character, you can do certain logic depending on what unit status you applied. If you are doing this, you have to make sure that you create the node graph inside of the status node graph folder in the server node graphs. If you do it inside the entity or class item node graph folders, you're not going to be able to select it in the editor. Inside the node graph, you have 4 event nodes that you can work with. So in our case here, if we wanted to activate when we attach the unit status to a character, for example, you'll use the when unit status changes node. And this will get called when you initiate the unit status, or when another stack gets thrown in there, or if all the stacks run out and it ends. But there's also a when unit status ends event, so if you want to specifically listen for that, you can just listen to it here. Now shields are also unit statuses, so if you want to listen to when a shield is attacked, this is what you would use, and so you would use this event on a unit status that gives a shield to an entity. This last event node here, when elemental reaction event occurs, so this is actually for this unit status, monitor elemental reactions. Whenever a character causes an elemental reaction, or if an elemental reaction happens on the character, you can actually choose a couple options here, then it will notify that event, and so you can listen to it from here and do whatever logic you would want to do. But before we move on to adding effects, let me just delete this and finish up with the general information here. So for the source settings, you can have it so that different applier sources can stack. So every unit status has an applier. Every unit status keeps track of who applied the unit status to who. So if you have different sources that apply a unit status, you can configure this if you want the effect to stack, or if they come from different sources, maybe they shouldn't stack, right? And so you can have the option here. If you do allow different sources to stack unit statuses, then you can also record the latest applier, and you can access this in the node graphs. But if you disable this, if you don't allow stacking, then you can set a coexistence limit. And so what this controls is basically how many different sources can apply the same unit status on a character. So let's say you only want to allow 2 different sources to apply the same unit status. If a third different source tries to apply the same unit status, it's not going to work. So you can set it here to cannot update, or if you do want to allow it to work, then you can choose which ones to replace, which ones that are coexisting to replace. I'll put an image on the screen from the docs that explain what each option does. And lastly, we have yielding status list and replacement status list. So these are also a bit niche. They have their use cases, but basically yielding status list, you can specify here that if the character, for example, has a unit status that's in this list, then we're not going to be able to apply this unit status on top of it. It's going to fail. However, if let's say the character has some unit statuses in this list, then what's going to happen is when we try to apply this unit status, then it's going to get rid of all of these unit statuses that are on the player in this list. So we can add a jump boost here, and let's say for example this is a speed boost, right? Let's just for example say this is a speed boost. So if the character has a jump boost active and we try to apply a speed boost, it's going to get rid of the jump boost and then it's going to apply the speed boost. So now that we got the basics out of the way, let's go ahead into the effect details. And so this is kind of important because we have all of these options here for the different types of effects that we can add onto the player. However, you'll notice that some of these aren't effective on all entities. You see here that, for example, the fall efficiency change value. You see here that the effective on says character and creations, but you obviously can't put it on objects because objects don't have gravity. They can't fall. But as you can see, the effects are categorized into 3 sections. You have base attributes, and so these are kind of like these miscellaneous attributes that you can change. They're not categorized very well in my opinion, but for example, you can change how much fall damage the player takes or how much the player falls, right? This is kind of like a gravity modifier. You can change how fast they move or how fast they attack. Or you can change how much stamina they consume when they run. So, you know, things like that. Then you have damage process. And so this is kind of like the combat related things where you can adjust your defense, your attack, your crit. You can also add immunity to certain elemental damage. You can ignore certain defense that other characters have or your own character has. So if you're making a game that has a lot of combat related things, you'll probably want to use some of these eventually. And then lastly, we have special functions. So these are basically like the cool effects that you can add. For example, you can mount a special effect. And this is just like a VFX that you add on any object that can go along with your unit status so that you can make it more clear to the player that they have some kind of enhancement or effect, buff or debuff, right? So for example, in here, we can click on it. This is always going to be a looping effect. You can't have timed effects play. There's one here called animal up buff, which we see in the game when the characters have like a movement speed bonus, so things like that. You can make players invincible, lock their HP, which is kind of the same thing, but a little bit different. You can make things struggle, and this can work on creations and characters alike. Things like super jump and disabling sprint or gliding. This is where you add a shield also. If you ever wanted to add a shield, you would do it here. And there's a bunch here that I'm not going to go over all of them, but they're all pretty interesting. I'm going to leave a link in the description that's going to point to the documentation that explains what each one of these do. However, there is one unit status that I think is kind of deprecated, which is invisible to other players. When you add it, you see here that it says discarded. So I tested this myself and this doesn't work, so I'm assuming that's what discarded means here. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so with all the foundational things out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look at some of these unit statuses that I made. I have here the platform speed boost, which is the speed boost that I gain when I walk onto this electro platform here. You can see that the maximum stack layers is 1. It has an infinite duration, and the reason this is infinite is because I want the effect to persist while I'm on the platform. So over here, I have a collision trigger that gives me the unit status when I enter and takes it away when I leave. And so while I'm in the collision trigger, I obviously don't want it to run out, so I just set the duration to infinite and I control it by adding it and removing it. If we go to the effect details, you'll see that I have here a movement speed adjustment rate for 40%, which is the maximum. You can't go higher than it, and if you try to stack multiple unit statuses together, it's still going to cap out at 40. Even if you have like two 40% adjustments on top of each other, it doesn't go higher than 40%. And then I also have this enable outline effect, which gives me a custom color. You kind of saw it at the beginning of the video, but it basically outlines my character, and this works on everything, by the way, objects, creations, and characters. You can also choose a faction color, but in my case, custom color, I just chose purple over here, just so that it matches with the platform itself. Similarly, we also have this jump, which just uses the super jump. Also maxes out on 5 on each of the axes, so you can only modify your jump by 5 times the amount, and that's pretty much it. I set a specify color to green. And then I have here a geo shield. So this works a little bit differently. You see here in the effect details, when I add the shield, it actually asks me for a shield configuration. And so if we click into this and we open the shield management tool, we have a little area where we can add custom shields. So in my case here, I went ahead and made a geo shield. It has its own configuration ID. And I set up the settings over here so that it has a lot of points. Infinite absorption, which just means that no matter how much damage it takes, it just reduces 1 shield point. And so pretty much just overpowered stats in general. But yeah, I have this geo shield. I reference it in the shield configuration, and then in order to make it clear to the player that I have a shield, I mount a special effect called Geo Shield. And obviously if I play it here, you see it appears. I use the attachment point, which is going to be the attachment point of whatever the unit status is on. So in my case here, it's the avatar root of the character. This isn't going to work if I attach it to an object, for example. And I think if the attachment point doesn't match up, it's just going to default to the root node. And of course, you have all of your other settings that come along with VFX, like follow location, rotation, the offset, the local filters, things like that. Now, another way that you can use unit statuses is through items. And I went over this in my previous videos where I covered items and all the effects that go along with them. So in my case here, for example, with the sword, you can see that it has this affix on it called attack boost. And if I go up here into manage equipment data, you'll see here that the attack boost actually applies a unit status, and the unit status is called attack boost. And so in here, in the unit status section, I have here my attack boost right here. It has an infinite duration because I want it to stick around while the character is equipping the sword, and it automatically gets removed whenever I unequip the sword. So you can use unit statuses in different places, not just through node graphs. So if we take a look at the sword again, and we go back to manage equipment data, you see here that the effective timing is when the item is equipped. And so it's going to apply the unit status that we defined, and then when it's unequipped, it's going to automatically remove the unit status from the player. Like I said, if you want to see how this works with items, I made a video about a week and a half ago that explains all of it, so make sure to go and check that out. But for those of you who are wondering how these platforms actually work, so let's go ahead and jump into the node graph side of things. We see here that these platforms have the unit status platform node graph attached to them. It has some node graph variables that we can set. And so the first one is obviously the unit status that we want the platform to give us. So I just put it in here. this is the speed buff that I made. And then I have an option for how long I should wait before I remove it after leaving the platform. So in my case, it's just 1 second. If we take a look inside the sandbox here, I have a folder called Unit Statuses. We have here 3 event nodes. We have when entering collision trigger, when exiting collision trigger, and when the timer is triggered. So just to kind of briefly explain it, not to go too much in detail, you can figure this out for yourself if you're interested. I left some notes here that explain, I think, all the important bits. But basically, when entering the collision, I add a unit status based on what I pass in through the node graph variables. And then when I exit the collision trigger, I start a timer that will remove the unit status after a certain delay, right? Based on whatever the node graph variable is here. So I put in 1 second, so this will just be in 1 second. And when the timer is triggered, I remove the unit status. Now the add unit status and remove unit status both take in an applier entity and a remover entity. And this is what I was explaining earlier, is that each unit status keeps track of who is applying and removing it. We also have the target entity on both of them, the configuration ID of the unit status, and how many stacks we want to apply, or in our case for the removal, we want to specify how we're removing the unit status. So we have 2 options. We can either remove all the coexisting statuses with the same name, so this is basically saying get rid of all of the unit statuses on the player that's the same unit status, or we can remove the unit status with the least time remaining. And in this case, the wording is a bit tricky here. Status with fastest stack loss. This basically is just saying that whichever unit status in the stack has the least amount of time remaining, just get rid of that one. That is usually the most common removal method, if it's not removing all of them, but it is missing a couple of options. Like you don't have the option to remove the newest one, for example, or any other type of removal methods. And in my understanding, there's no way to make your own custom logic for it, so we're kind of just stuck with these 2 options in the node graph. Aside from these execution nodes, we also have a couple of other options here, so let's just go over it real quick. In the query nodes, we can query if an entity has a unit status. This will just return true or false. Every status that we apply has its own slot ID, which is actually what gets returned here by the add unit status. If it fails or succeeds, it will tell you with the result. But if it succeeds, it's going to give you the slot ID that it put the unit status in. And so you can use this slot ID to get all sorts of things, such as the applier or how many stacks we have of the unit status. You can also get a list of all the slot IDs that are on the entity. You can also save the slot ID, and when the unit status changes, you can compare it with the slot ID that it throws in the event and run some logic only if the slot ID matches. By the way, I did make a standalone asset on the Resource Explorer just for these unit status platforms. So if you want to use them in your level and you want to kind of help me out and download it and show some support, I will leave a link in the description for you to check it out. I do want to quickly mention that you can also add unit statuses on ability units for projectiles. So if a projectile, for example, hits an enemy or a character and you want to add a unit status to the thing that was hit, you can also do that. And so you can add the unit status here. Let's say, for example, I want to add a speed boost to whatever I hit. You could do that. And then of course, add layers. This is how many stacks you can apply. However, to my knowledge, you can't use this add unit status ability unit type for anything other than projectiles. So for example, if I just go to this dummy and I try to add a unit status here, you can only do hitbox attack, direct attack, or recover HP. So I think right now unit statuses are solely reserved for projectiles. And so yeah, that pretty much sums it up. Unit statuses are very helpful in combat related scenarios, or if you want to make some kind of puzzles, or if you want to add some cool effects like outlines and things like that. And if you guys have any questions in how to apply a unit status or anything specific, just leave them in the comments and I'll answer them as best as I can.